before we start the program and get the panelists, we'd like complete silence. And Kiran Malhotra, founder of Art Forum SF, is going to give a welcome and a thank you speech. Please welcome her.
So I do not know about the welcome speech and the thank you speech, but thank you for being here. This is amazing. I'm glad Shashi has got such a huge audience for himself. And I just need to take a few minutes. I'm not going to keep you away from him, but I need to recognize a few things to say thank you to lots of people. Over the last 2 days, we have been inspired by 60 speakers, 23 panels, 10 poets, 12 artists, 14 vendors of the marketplace, and 4 performances and an artist workshop. It's just amazing what we have been able to do for ourselves here. And I do not see my Stanford hosts here. Thank you so much for hosting us here. And I do not want to keep you away from these 2 gentlemen. I will give the stage in less than 30 seconds. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, moderators. Thank you for giving us the conversations and with this enthusiastic audience. Thank you, all of you. I just need to take just another 10 seconds. None of this would have been possible without the volunteers who have been keeping us all together. And a huge, huge, huge shout out to the tech team. The tech team. None of us can be there without all of them. A special hand for them, please. Yeah. And I cannot forget the sponsors, the donors, the special mention, India House Foundation. I see them here somewhere. I saw them 2 seconds ago. Thank you for raising your hand, both of you, for sponsoring Shashi's panel today. Thank you so much, and I'd like, where is Dinsha gone? All right, I hand over the mic to Dinsha. Thank you.
Wow, I've actually been working at Hoover now for 3 years. This is the biggest room I've seen. This is standing room only. This is a great thing for Sala, and of course a great thing for our speakers. Seems like it's been a great event so far. My name's Dinsha Mistry. I'm a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. And this evening I'm thrilled to welcome you all here. We've got Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He's a person, I think, who needs no introduction in this room. But of course, he's one that deserves quite a long encomium, if nothing else. His illustrious career at the United Nations, culminating in his role as Undersecretary General, and his current service as a Member of Parliament in India, underscore his deep commitment to international diplomacy and service. I think whether you're left or right in the US or in India, that's something that we should celebrate and acknowledge whenever we get a chance. For anyone who has seen his parliamentary speeches or his talks and debates on YouTube, you also know that Dr. Tharoor is an orator par excellence. So we should have some pretty high hopes for tonight. Perhaps most importantly for our purposes tonight as well, Dr. Tharoor is a prolific author, having penned over 20 books. He's going to be joined this evening by my colleague, Dr. Shumit Ganguly. Dr. Ganguly recently joined us at Stanford, having previously spent 20 years at Indiana University, Bloomington. Dr. Ganguly writes on politics and international affairs with a special focus on South Asia. The way it's going to work tonight, I'm going to invite Shumit to kick it off, Shumit Ganguly, by asking a few questions. For about 40 minutes or so, they're going to engage in a fireside chat. Then for the last 20 minutes or so, we've got mics set up right there. I'll come back on stage, and we'll hopefully have people that we can, who might be interested in, I don't know, perhaps, in asking some questions. It seems like this is a pretty quiet audience. Doesn't seem like too many people turned up, don't want to really understand the deep issues of the day. That's a joke, of course, I'm being facetious. But we'll save some time at the end for questions for the crowd. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shashi Tharoor to campus.
Thank you, it's great to be here. Thank you, it's great to be here and great to see you all. Thank you.
At the very outset, even at the cost of seeming to engage in a ritualistic incantation, I am deeply grateful to the organizers of this festival for asking me to engage in this conversation with a dear friend of many decades. I am a newcomer to Stanford, as the intro pointed out, having just joined the Hoover Institution a mere 3 weeks ago, which makes this event particularly momentous and significant.
And what's worse is he gave up the best title in American academia ever. He was the Rabindranath Tagore Professor of Indian Civilization. Can you imagine? So Stanford's really lucky to have this guy.
Despite the risk of appearing overly self-referential, I'm compelled to preface this conversation with a personal anecdote. It was a typical sultry afternoon over 5 decades ago at St. Xavier's Collegiate School in Calcutta when I met Shashi on the ground floor corridor during our lunch recess. Many of us already had an inkling of his subsequent literary fame and success, as he was one of the key editors of the school newspaper, Nihil Ultra, Nothing Beyond. Shashi, who was a year senior to me, stopped and turned around to ask me if I was Shumit Ganguly. Somewhat abashedly, I said, yes, indeed, I was. To my utter delight, he told me that he had been reading my columns in the paper and that he was quite impressed with their quality. That, to coin a phrase, was the start of a beautiful friendship. Of course, little did I know at that time that over 50 years later, I would have the privilege of participating in a conversation with him here at Stanford. And so without any further ado, I'm going to plunge into a series of questions. We were both teenagers a long time ago when you were publishing in the Junior Statesman, later JS, and at the cost of dating us both, in Eve's Weekly and the Illustrated Weekly of India, the venerable magazine edited by Khushwant Singh. Sadly, all of them are now gone. It is possible that today you are inclined to treat those literary forays as mere juvenilia. However, at that stage, were you envisaging a career, a literary career, rather than this extraordinary career in diplomacy with your literary pursuits merely as an avocation?
It's tough to put oneself back in one's teenage shoes. I'm not quite sure that I was very clear in what I wanted to do. I had a number of interests, and I was pursuing them all, as teenagers tend to do, and somehow I never quite grew out of that, I think. I was always very tempted by the idea of the Indian Foreign Service, and I thought I would write the examination. The one thing you remember I was good at throughout school and after was in coming first at exams. It's not a particular thing to boast about, because it really doesn't reflect anything other than an ability to take examinations. But that I had, and that was the way you got into the Foreign Service, so I assumed that was a realistic ambition. And then I enjoyed writing. And once you've seen your name in print, it's as addictive as the first bite of chocolate or the first kiss or whatever else your addiction happens to be. And having seen my name in print at the age of 10, I just kept writing. I just couldn't get rid of that addiction. So both things were going on at the same time. I sort of came of age and became old enough to write the examinations when the emergency was going on, and that was a very disillusioning period for anybody who had some convictions and dreams and aspirations for the country. And I just couldn't bring myself to write the UPSC examinations at that point. I said, how can I serve a government that can do this to its people? That was, of course, very naive and idealistic, and of course, the emergency didn't last very long, and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi called free and fair elections and lost them and moved aside, and that was that. But in the meantime, sort of, I began to seriously consider what to do with myself. I had postponed a decision by doing a PhD in 100 hurries. I finished my doctorate at 22. But while writing it, the two options that seemed viable would be either academics or journalism, because I had decided not to write the examinations for the service. And suddenly a third idea came up, and that was whether one couldn't do sort of international affairs from outside rather than from within the country. And the United Nations seemed to be a possibility. Mind you, Indians were chronically overrepresented, and the main UN service had national quotas, but there was an organization, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that didn't have any national quotas. And so that's where I got it instead. Initially on a 1-month contract, that became a 1-year contract, and I continued. And when I joined it in 1978, having defended my thesis on a Friday, got on a plane Saturday, arrived in Geneva Sunday, and began work on Monday, wearing a borrowed tie because I'd forgotten to pack any. When all that happened, I little realized that I was launching a 29-year career in international affairs. Now, I'm not sure anymore whether that answers your question, but I think if that had not happened, the other thing I might have done would have been to go into journalism. It was certainly a world I knew because my dad was on the other side of the fence. He was an advertisement manager for a leading Indian newspaper. So I could have, I had newspaper ink running in my veins from a very young age, but this is the career that opened, and then I did this and wrote nights and weekends and wrote books instead of journalism.
Just to depart from the script, two issues or episodes, vignettes occur to me. One was you had seriously considered at one point, as you were finishing your PhD, to go back and run a magazine by Bhavani Sengupta.
Yes, Perspectives. That's romantic. Gosh, yes. Oh, you remember that. I'd forgotten it myself. Bhavani Sengupta was this Bengali intellectual displaced in Calcutta who started a magazine called Perspectives, which actually didn't last very long, didn't outlive him. But while it was on, it had some very interesting writing, and I think he had persuaded me to contribute a couple of articles to it, and then he did offer me the editorship. But I don't think I really thought of it very seriously. The other thing he did was found the Center for Policy Research,
right.
The think tank which then grew to become India's most important and influential, and is now in the process of being decimated by the present government.
And the other, your long statement, response triggered something else in my mind. And again, you'll find this amusing, and perhaps you might actually even recall this. Since you were a year ahead of me, I looked up to you for many things, quite apart from the student newspaper and JS. But I distinctly remember you telling me that for the Indian history paper, you said, use very good English and put in as many quotes as you can imagine. And Dr. Bhanjdev, his name was Siddheswari Prasad Bhanjdev. He said, Dr. Bhanjdev will give you the first that you so dearly want in history.
And you did get it.
And it worked. And
Sure.
on another occasion, there was Godrej Engineer, who was our elocution teacher. You said, pick out a major speech and just deliver it with verve. And by God, you'll be first. Lo and behold, that too worked.
Little did I realize I had the makings of such a good faculty advisor. I didn't go into it anyway.
Without even intending to. Okay. In your 1989 book, and I still have an autographed copy on my shelf, it made it all the way to Stanford, in my judgment, was a landmark event in your literary career. The novel, despite its jocular tone in many places, in my view, has two key highlights. First, your subtle grasp of the particulars of one of India's two great religious and cultural epics, the Mahabharata. And second, your dexterity in using the complex account to illuminate elements of an era in post-independence Indian politics. Is this a fair characterization of the central elements of the novel?
It's generous. I mean, it was, yeah, it was a first in those respects, as you said. We're talking about my first novel, The Great
Indian Novel.
Which, as the title itself indicates, was very much a satirical novel. It wasn't an attempt to or rather, it was an attempt to tackle two very serious issues. The Mahabharata, which had this huge sort of place in the Indian public consciousness, and the popular understanding of the nationalist movement and the freedom struggle, and then the trials and tribulations of independence, in an allegorical form, by taking the stories, incidents, characters, and even philosophies in the epic and transmuting them to the 20th century. So it was a complex undertaking, but you know, as with any first novels, you throw everything of yourself into it because A, you don't know whether you'll ever succeed in writing it, so you usually tend to be very ambitious. Second, you don't know once you've written it whether anyone will ever publish it, so you're kind of somewhat reckless with all you want to put into it. And third, you never know if you'll ever do it again, so you may as well throw everything that matters to you into it. So it became my sort of great evocation of everything that mattered to me in 20th century India, and at the same time, having been a relatively recent graduate of St. Stephen's College, where the pun is sort of the fundamental sort of mark of Stephanian existence, or it used to be anyway in those days. One wanted to be as tongue-in-cheek and humorous as possible. And I tried a number of stylistic experiments too. I mean, as many of you probably know, the Mahabharata is actually not a prose epic. It's a poem, and it's the world's longest poem, 5 times the length of the Bible. And most translators have either just simply been defeated by the epic of rendering that entire thing in verse, and so they've either done it in prose and just told the story of the Mahabharata, or there was a particular Professor P. Lal in Calcutta who wrote what he called a transcreation of the Mahabharata, in which he told the story but occasionally burst into verse to convey something of the poetic quality of the original. So I rather shamelessly borrowed that technique because when you're writing a satirical novel about two very serious things, you need to somehow have a device to justify the satire, or indeed to break the mood if it became overly serious. And verse seemed to me to offer the best way of doing it. So every once in a while, the novel breaks into limericks and doggerel and lyrics, and even sometimes a sort of mock serious retelling of the Bhagavad Gita in iambic tetrameter. But all of this was done in a very sort of experimental way, and I think some professor hailed it as India's first postmodernist novel and so on and so forth, which I hadn't really thought about. What I was more interested in at that point was finding a readable way to impart what I thought were the valuable lessons, taking the light cast by the epics on the events of the present and re-examining our very conventional assumptions about the present through the eyes of the past. And anyway, it seemed to work because it won a few awards and is still in print all these decades later. 35 years ago it was first published, and it's very gratifying to me to see young people who weren't born when the book first came out coming to me, clutching copies and asking for signatures. So that's a gratifying moment for me as a writer.
To move on, in 1992, you published Show Business, which I think is the most delightful send-up of Bollywood. The satirical quality of that novel centered around the character of Ashok Banjara, and I won't reveal to this audience whom it's modeled after.
I think people can guess from the initials right there. But
lest somebody threaten to decapitate me. But if you were to revisit and rewrite the novel, how might you modify it in light of how Bollywood has changed and hasn't changed in many ways over the decades.
You can't ask a writer how you'd modify a book. It's like asking a parent how you'd re-edit your child's genes. You know, just as when you produce a child with all their qualities and imperfections, you let them out into the world and it's up to them to make their way. So it is with books. You've written it. It really has to find its own way in the world. I will say, though, that it was as a book, it had a very peculiar reception in that it was panned in India and a huge hit abroad. It was the first Indian novel ever reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, which was a major distinction in those days, and I was thrilled. It was picked by the Washington Post as one of the 4 best books of the year, which was quite astonishing, given that at that point I was completely immersed in dealing with the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, and had almost forgotten that I had another life. And I got calls from all over the place saying, 3-book contracts, and when's the next one coming, and what you're going to write about next, and being pursued by agents and everyone else. And I said, sorry, I'm dealing with Yugoslavia, and I didn't write another word for 5 years, in fact. But anyway, that was briefly the high watermark of my literary success. But it was, again, one of the things about the great Indian novel I tried to do was to explore through fiction the kinds of stories a society tells about itself. And those were the stories for me of the epic and the nationalist movement. So for my second novel, I stuck to that same prism. What are the stories we tell about ourselves? What do we experience? What is the average Indian experience by way of a fictional experience? And the obvious answer was movies, Bollywood. That's what essentially everybody goes to. And those days, of course, before television became ubiquitous and we had 600 channels and so on, which we didn't in those days. We had one. And it was rather dull and had lots of agricultural programs. So therefore, what I did was, my gosh, we've got our first walkouts already. Have I really been that offensive? All right. Anyway, I thought I would use the device of cinema. So it starts off with a very popular megastar lying in a coma in a hospital bed, reliving his life, as it were, in a series of flashbacks, interspersed with the very tongue-in-cheek scripts of the movies he's acted in at different phases of his life, complete with madcap lyrics and everything else, and further interspersed with characters from his life talking to him at the request of the doctors in a bid to try and get him out of his coma. They're all anxious to see whether there's some flicker of recognition, some response. So you have his father, you have his wife, you have his brother, you have the stock villain from cinema. It said all of them coming in one after the other talking to him. So again, it was a bit experimental in terms of structure and form, but it was again about the stories of Bollywood and what it meant for Indian society and the stories of those who make them. And it was reasonably true to its time. I actually went to Filmistan in Bombay and watched films being made and everything from the makes of the cameras being used in those days to the kinds of experiences people had on sets were fairly authentic. But I think partially in India, the reaction was, how could the author of the great Indian novel descend to writing about Bollywood? And in the West, it was, my gosh, here's this dazzling world we've been introduced to for the rest of the cinema. Anyway, so that was the story of the movie, of the book show business. And then I stopped writing satire. Life became too serious.
Yes, and that's the perfect segue to the next question I'm going to raise, because we're moving away from, despite satire, there was a kind of a jocular leitmotif through both. I mean, I distinctly remember at the beginning of the great Indian novel, you talk about the snout of Lord Ganesh. And as he's taking dictation.
Well, you remember the conceit in many of the versions of the Mahabharata is that Ved Vyas is dictating
Right.
The Mahabharata to Lord Ganesha, Ganapati. So how do you put that in the 20th century, right? So I have a cantankerous old politician in his dotage and in his anecdotage called Ved Vyas, who is dictating his memoirs to a South Indian secretary called Ganapati, who comes in dragging his enormous trunk behind him. But this is a trunk containing his clothes, you see, because he's been ordered by Ved Vyas to stay with him so he can take dictation as he speaks. And so it's this kind of trying to transmute elements from the epic into something that could stand up to 20th century credibility. That's what it was trying to do.
As I was saying, that we're moving to something slightly more serious and fraught. Given the sheer volume of your publications, which Dinshaw alluded to, both literary and otherwise, I cannot possibly invoke and discuss every one of them, because otherwise we'd be here all night. However, I am compelled to bring up your 2001 book, Riot. The narrative mode with diverse perspectives reminds one of Kurosawa's Rashomon. Having witnessed and studied riots in India as an academic, I found the multiple perspectives on that tragic death, which is at the core of the novel, to be sort of, the multiple perspectives are sort of archetypical of individuals from various social strata, from official positions like the magistrate, and from a variety of cultural backgrounds, the Sikh policeman, for example. Apart from the very fraught time when you wrote the novel, what was the motivation for writing this novel?
Well, there were many things. As I said, I'd had this long gap after show business, and it was punctuated by a non-fiction book, my first one after my PhD thesis, a book called India from Midnight to the Millennium, which surveyed in a very personal, individualistic manner the first 50 years of India's independence. Having published that, my workload and responsibilities of the UN kept going up as well. So finding the time to write was more and more challenging, but I was more and more disturbed by what I was seeing happening in India. The 90s were a period of a fair amount of challenge, but you may remember it began with the destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya, which was the peak of an agitation throughout the 80s led by the so-called Sangh Parivar of organizations spearheaded by the BJP, which vowed to replace that mosque, which they believed stood on the site of an ancient Hindu temple, with a new temple to the Lord Ram. Now, what had been forgotten was there had actually been a number of riots and incidents before the demolition of the masjid. In the late 80s, there had been something called the Ram Shila Pujans, where particularly across the Hindi-speaking states, there was a movement as part of this Ram Janmabhoomi Yatras to get people to bake consecrated bricks, and then those bricks would be transported to Ayodhya to build the future temple. Of course, they never were used for the future temple, but that's another matter. And in connection with that, a number of riots took place. Now, a classmate of mine, who's since become rather well known in his later life, Harsh Mandar, was an IAS officer at the time. And of course, as an IAS officer, he couldn't speak out publicly, all right? But he was very disturbed by this. And he happened to be the district magistrate serving in a particular town in Madhya Pradesh called Khargone, where there had been such a riot. And he shared with me privately his notes of that riot. When I say his notes, I would say 19, 20 pages was about it. But it was detailed and dense and amazingly revelatory of the inner dynamics of a riot taking place. And with his permission, I decided to use those notes as a recreation of that moment in time. The riot he was at took place in 1989, the very year I published the Great Indian Novel, and 3 years before the destruction of the mosque, the Babri Masjid. So I thought it was a very interesting snapshot of a historical moment. And then I invented, in fact, to be very honest, a newspaper headline from that period was about a white American woman who'd gone to South Africa to work against apartheid and had been killed by black people in a black suburb in a riot or something else there. And that had also captured my imagination. I wondered, here's somebody going with the best of intentions, but not fully understood and ultimately destroyed by forces she couldn't comprehend either, and who couldn't comprehend her. And then I decided to merge the two. So I made my novel about, it begins very openly, there's no hiding. It begins with the death of this American girl in a riot in India. It features her parents, who are divorced, coming back to India to see where their daughter lived and worked and find out what's happening. The father turns out to have been a Coca-Cola executive who was trying to reintroduce his product into India after the Coke had been expelled from the country. There's a New York Times kind of newspaper, I didn't use the name, the New York Times, journalist coming to follow the parents and look into the story. There's a district magistrate himself, whom I gave a background rather like my own, going to an elite college in Delhi, Indian Administrative Service, thrust into a job in a rural area. But he, unlike me, had an arranged marriage in which he was not terribly happy. And he meets this American girl, and so their relationship becomes one of the elements in the novel. And then there's also the cop whom Shumit alludes to, a police officer, IPS, but a Sikh who has lived through the Sikh riots that disfigured the country just 5 years before the events of this novel in 1984. So I've got all of these elements coming in, which are all major strands of things that had disturbed what India was all about to me and disturbed the fabric of Indian society and Indian democracy. And then I had a voice of the Sangh Parivar character, somebody whose passionate evocations of Hindu nationalism I expressed as fairly and authentically as I could. And there was a Muslim historian, right, again from a university like Delhi University, and his evocations of North Indian syncretism. So all these different voices had to be expressed in tones authentic to them. And so there are 13 different voices in the novel. And the novel is written in a peculiar way. It's got newspaper clippings, transcripts of interviews, diary entries, poems written by the American girl who's an amateur poet, and her own memories, her own jottings in her diary, which her parents find. Or rather, her parents come looking for, but the district magistrate has found it, the cop has found it and given it to the district magistrate. And you've got the cop who's a heavy drinker at night, talking about his experiences and memories of the riots and why he wants to stay in the service rather than resign and protest against a society that could do this to his people. You've got all of these different voices. You've got the liberal historian who happens to be Muslim. You've got the passionate Hindu nationalist. All of these different voices speaking from different perspectives. And in a peculiar sort of way, the book can be picked up and read in any order. You don't actually, because you already know the ending at the beginning. The girl's been killed. But as the parents try and find out what happened, you discover bits and pieces. And the interesting thing is nobody in the novel actually knows the whole story except the reader. Everyone has a bit and piece of it. And ironically, I had not seen, and I still haven't seen Rashomon. But of course, that was a parallel that occurred to many. But I guess that means that creative people can think alike once in a while. I just had these different voices, these different perspectives, but I had one core story coming to me from Hashmanda's notes. And that was what Riot, the novel, was all about. When it was launched in Delhi, I remember the publisher, David, our Penguin, using an adjective that I don't think has been used for fiction before. He called it a necessary novel. And it's striking because when the novel came out, the US edition was actually meant to be released on 9/11/2001. and all the sort of passions, the fanaticisms, the rage, everything else that one associates with that moment had been written about in the book. And when the book came out, both in India and the US in late 2001, as many of you may know, a few months later, there were the savage quote-unquote riots or pogrom or whatever in Gujarat, where 1,300 people were possibly killed in targeted violence, aiming principally at the Muslim community of Gujarat. And so you had a lot of things happening that showed, that threw the novel into a certain kind of relief. Perhaps it was uncomfortable for many. I don't know whether it ever did as well as I believed it deserved to do, but I'm very proud of it, and it stands by itself. Actually, I haven't written a novel since for other reasons, and the other reasons are that I think with fiction, you need not just time, which was challenging enough for me as a full-time employee of the UN and later as a full-time politician, but you need a space inside your head to create an alternative moral universe, to populate it with characters, episodes, incidents, lines of dialogue that should be as real to you while you're inhabiting that world as the world you're actually living in. And that became increasingly impossible. In the first decade of the 21st century after riot, my novel became littered with, not even half-completed, I would say half-begun novels that I'd begun writing and just had to abandon, because each time you write a novel, you're constructing this glass palace of illusion. And every time it's interrupted, you're dragged away to something more urgent, more important. A crack develops in that pattern. And if that happens too often, the cracked glass just shatters and the whole palace collapses on you. And that happened to me 3 or 4 times with different attempts at novels. And I finally said, this is crazy. I can't keep doing this. I am a writer. I need to write. So why don't I write things I can actually, that can be interrupted? Nonfiction is interruptible. We're all speaking nonfiction all the time. So when you write something that's a piece of prose, even if it's an argument, and it's interrupted for 6 weeks or 7 weeks, well, you can come back, see what you were writing, reread what you've written, and surely, if you're writing from your heart as well as your mind, the train of thought, the line of argument will recur to you, and you'll come back and write some more. And that's exactly what I did. So all my books since Riot. So 4 of my first 5 books were all fiction, and my last 21 books have all been non-fiction. So I keep getting letters every time I publish a book saying, when's your next novel coming? And I don't know how to answer it. So I joke sometimes that one day the voters will return me to the world of literature. But maybe I won't
Not
wait that
anytime
long.
soon.
Maybe I'll try and go back to it.
I'm well aware that I am standing between you and the audience, which I'm sure has a plethora of questions. And I'm also acutely cognizant that this is a literary and arts festival, and so I should not stray into political issues. However, I am going to take the liberty of mentioning your first scholarly book, Reasons of State, as it was an inspiration to a generation of international relations scholars such as myself, as it was the first theoretically grounded analysis of India's foreign policy based on your doctoral dissertation at Tufts. With the usual benefit of hindsight, may I be so bold as to ask you, how would you tweak it today?
Well, Shumit, you constantly want to rewrite things. That worries me a little bit in a scholar here. He's obviously been telling too many of his students to rewrite their submissions to him. I think it was true to its time. It was a book about the making of Indian foreign policy, institutions, personnel, processes, under Indira Gandhi's first term, 66 to 77, when the book was published in 81, so there was a little epilogue trying to bring it up to date. And its originality was that I was incredibly lucky with the time I was doing it, and that I had a lot of candid interviews that would not normally have been available. What happened was that my thesis proposal was approved just about the time that Indira Gandhi's government fell in March of 77. So not only she herself, but all her top advisors were willing to talk in ways they would not have been had she still been in power. Because at that point, it was for a brief spasm of time, for about a year, it was assumed she was done for good and would never come back. So everyone was talking very freely. She had 4 foreign ministers who were all alive and all willing to talk. And all her principal advisors in her office were willing to talk. And so I had the most astonishing collection of candid interviews, unfortunately recorded on cassette tapes that have since been destroyed with humidity and time. But I did take notes, and I had a key for the thesis advisors as to which interview corresponded to which, since they were confidential for the most part, other than her own interview, which was on the record. All the others were confidential, but I was able to say, if the thesis advisor said, "Who said this to you?" I could say it was so-and-so, or Mr. Haksar, or Mr. Parthasarathi, or whoever it was, amongst her immediate advisors who had let me into a particular insight. So it was very, very insightful into the way policy was made under Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And I think to that degree, it remains accurate and true for its time. Obviously, that was now almost half a century ago, and a lot has changed. And anyone writing, in fact, there was a fellow in Chicago who sort of did a very imitative doctorate in the early 90s on the same topic, on the same theme, and he was accused of plagiarism by more than one reviewer, but he got his PhD, so I don't know how Chicago sometimes works. But I think anyone writing one today would have a more challenging time, both because the various administrations that followed Indira Gandhi were each so different from each other, and there were very many differences, but also because in recent years we have seen certain divergences in the assumptions and nature of Indian foreign policy making, which would, I think, be a little more challenging to capture. But it's been for me, it's a book I'm proud of. Of course, it's the very first book I ever published, and it was also a book emerging from a doctoral thesis, which you know, many doctorates never get published. So it was special for me to be able to have that opportunity to see the book in print.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shubha.
Believe now Dinshaw is going to open up the floor to the audience, and he will be, and there are microphones in both aisles, so please line up before the microphone if you wish to ask a question. And Dinshaw will moderate.
Yes, Dinshaw, if you have a question yourself, you're welcome to break the ice.
I'll break the ice with a small one. You've given us, I think some of us are going to go home and read the 20-plus works of Shashi Tharoor. What have you read recently that you would add to the list? Somebody else, some other book that you've seen in the last year or two? What are you reading? What are you thinking about? What would you recommend to your friends here?
Well, I must say, I've always been a big fan of Salman Rushdie. In fact, when I wrote my review of the great Indian novel for the Singapore paper, the Straits Times, I called it the great Indian novel. And then I misappropriated my own reference for my own title when I wrote a novel. But I thought his new book, not so new anymore, but a year or two ago, called Victory City, is worth recommending, especially to the Indians in the audience, because it's an amazing imagination, reimagination of the Vijayanagar Empire with all his magical realism and everything else. But it's back, seeing Rushdie back in full form is delightful.
Excellent. Let's start there.
Hi. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, Dr. Ganguly, for being
Hi, tell
here.
me who you are and sort of what you're studying,
Sounds
if you're
good.
still a student.
Yeah,
or you're teaching,
I'm Love
if you're not.
Shawani. I'm a sophomore, and alongside my best friend from Pakistan, Ayman, we co-founded Stanford's first tracked initiative on Indo-Pak Dosti Forum. So my
Indo-Pak
question,
what
Indo-Pak
forum?
Dosti Forum.
Dosti Forum, all right.
So I have a couple of questions. My first question is, what advice would you give to non-state actors, specifically students, on improving relations, people-to-people relations with Pakistan? And second, how would an Congress-led India alliance differ from its approach to Pakistan compared to the BJP-led India alliance? Thank you so much.
We could spend the entire evening on that, so it's a vast topic. On Pakistan, I must say, I started off very much in the Dosti camp and ended up feeling a bit mugged by reality. And over the years, I have to admit that my own position has hardened in some respects. I obviously one of those Indians who lamented that both countries are wasting so much of their resources in hostility to each other and in military preparedness. And since the late 80s that Pakistan has been sending so many terrorists and militants across the border to wreak havoc on innocent Indians with no good consequence for them and as a result, but it's keeping on happening in pursuance of this folly of a death by 1,000 cuts, which India is not going to die with 1,000 cuts or 1,000,000 for that matter, but that's unfortunately the mentality of the evil men who do this from Pakistan. The reason I've been mugged by reality is that so many attempts at peace have been stymied by one simple reality. And that is that whereas in India the state has an army, in Pakistan the army has a state. And the result of that has been that we have seen repeatedly, I mean, I've got a sentence in one of my books saying the problem with these two countries is that they shout cease and fire at different times. But I mean, in many ways, it's true. Whenever India has attempted to make peace, and we've had some amazing examples. I could give you a dozen, but just to take a couple, you remember Mr. Vajpayee, the BJP, the first BJP Prime Minister of India, making that dramatic bus trip to Lahore and making this enormous gesture because the BJP had historically rejected the partition to go to the big Minar where Jinnah had established Pakistan and speaking there. Embracing the idea of peace with Pakistan. And within 3 months, what did we get? We got the Kargil misadventure by the Pakistan military, which cost so many thousand lives in our country. That was one example of a major betrayal. A second one would be what happened in 26/11, 2008. We count dates differently from Americans, so the date comes before the month. When India had really reached out, despite the Kargil war 10 years earlier, to really extend a hand of friendship to Pakistan. There seemed to be a reciprocation from the then government of President Zardari. And in fact, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi was actually in Delhi to discuss with India a more liberalized visa regime between the countries on the verge of being signed when 26/11 erupted. And it became apparent to the Indian government, even those who wanted peace, that the people who we're talking peace with did not have the ability to control the men who sent out the guns and the bombs from that country. I mean, 26/11 was particularly chilling because of the accumulation of evidence, the chilling voice of the handler in Pakistan who was giving instructions minute by minute to the terrorists to kill. And they were talking and literally getting orders at the time, all of which was recorded by Indian intelligence and we gather by some other foreign intelligence organizations, the US and Britain and so on. And after that, it almost became impossible to contemplate normal relations. In fact, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had genuinely, and I know this personally, wanted peace with Pakistan to be his major legacy. And he'd gone very far with the so-called back-channel negotiations with President Musharraf, which then ended when Musharraf lost control, but he'd picked up the threads with President Zardari, and then 26/11 happened. And at that point, it was just impossible. I mean, even if he'd wanted to try and go again, make peace, the opposition, the BJP, would never have allowed him to, and public opinion was deeply hostile. It was all he could do to stave off the clamor in the country and in the political class to bomb Pakistan. As there are many other betrayals, including the attack on parliament, many, many other instances. Then Mr. Modi decides that he's going to turn a new page. And of course, there's many who believe that just as it took a Republican president like Nixon to make the opening to communist China, so too it would need a BJP prime minister to make an opening to Pakistan, because the Congress is full of peaceniks who wouldn't stand in his way. That was always the assumption. So when Mr. Modi decided to invite the Prime Minister of Pakistan to his inauguration in 2014, that was the beginning potentially of a thaw. And there were better relations. And then he went to Kabul in December of 2015. It was Christmas Day. He was flying back to Delhi, and he was reminded that he had to call the Pakistani Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, and wish him on his birthday. So literally, while the entire delegation were in their cars outside on the road, he called Nawaz Sharif to say happy birthday. And Nawaz Sharif said, but you're flying over my country. Between Kabul and Delhi, you should stop on the way and join the celebration. It's also my granddaughter's wedding. Come and attend the wedding. You'll be an honored guest. And Modi very impulsively and spontaneously said yes. This was an utter shock to the Indian delegation because there wasn't enough physical time for the Indian ambassador in Islamabad to travel to Lahore and receive his own prime minister when he landed there, because it's a very short flight from Kabul to Lahore, and it's a much longer drive from Islamabad to Lahore. But he went ahead, and it was the most astonishingly generous gesture. He went there, he attended the birthday and the wedding. They always have gifts in their luggage, so gifts were exchanged. Much joy and thing. And what happened immediately, the very following month, was an attack on the Pathankot air base by Pakistani terrorists. Mr. Modi was still unwilling to blame. He said, no, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif could never do this to me. So he actually invited the Pakistanis to be part of the investigation into the attack on the airbase. And the Pakistanis, the Indian security establishment was horrified. They said, how can this be allowed? How can you let Pakistani intelligence take a look at an Indian airbase? But he said, no, we have to turn a new page. We have to make this happen. And the Pakistani spooks came along with their delegation and looked at our airbase and everything else. And they went back and told the Pakistani public, oh, the Indians did it to themselves. And you can imagine the sense of betrayal in Delhi, the sense that you cannot possibly trust these people and make peace with them. So, to cut a long story short, that's one of the problems with the candles at Wagah border kind of scenario, which is that how do you talk peace with people who, the ones who want to talk to you are unable to deliver peace, and the ones who are not talking to you are determined to keep going, because the one way in which the Pakistani military are able to maintain their extraordinarily high share of their country's GDP and budget and control of the economy is by maintaining hostility on both their borders. That's the only way they can do it. Today, no army of any country in the world gets a larger share of the country's resources than Pakistan's does. In India, you join the army to serve the country, defend it. In Pakistan, you join the army to run the country. And it goes on after retirement. You get petrol stations and universities and real estate transactions and import-export companies, all of which are run by retired militaries. So, why would you want to deprive yourself of all of that by making peace with your neighbors? That's the fundamental existential problem we have. Nonetheless, when you ask your second part of your question, I think one difference we would have is we would like to see more people-to-people contact. Even if you have concluded that you cannot, that you don't have a willing, viable peace partner on the other side, there's no reason why you should cut off the kinds of contacts that were growing between people. And no Pakistani who'd visited India amongst the ordinary civilians, business people, cinema artists, singers, etc., ever went back feeling anything but warmth towards India. And probably the same is true of most Indians who'd been to Pakistan. That's dried up to a great extent. It's a trickle now on both sides. If we can open that up and liberalize, maybe we'll create a larger constituency for peace for the time when one day it becomes possible. Maybe one day the Pakistani civil society will become strong enough to put the military in its place. Maybe one day the military, there's no doubt that during the Imran Khan government, General Bajwa and his military were actually very keen on peace with India. But by then, India was too burned to want to make peace with them. So that's what I meant by seas and fire at different times, They wanted to talk peace. We were not prepared to talk to them. We didn't trust them anymore. That kind of problem continues. So what advice can I give you? At your age, continue to stand for dosti, please. But accept the fact that some of us who did that for a long time have become cynical because of our experiences. And let me hope that your experiences over the next few decades will be better than ours were in the last few.
All right. That's actually a student-initiated class. There's a lot of hunger on this campus to learn more about what's happening in India, Pakistan. No more questions about India, Pakistan, or else 20 minutes will go by. Please,
Hi,
introduce yourself.
My name is Soren Doshi. I'm a management consultant. I've worked in the last 30 years, 15 years with some of the largest family-run businesses in India, and the other 15 years with large corporations here. My two questions, Dr. Tharoor. One is, in the last 10 years, we've seen progress in terms of economic development in India. At what cost have they come? It would be good to sort of hear your sense on the restrictions on freedom of speech as well as...
Sorry, but decisions on?
Restrictions on freedom of speech,
Yeah.
as well as lack or reduction in secularity.
Yeah, I mean, those are precisely some of the worrying things that we've been seeing in the last decade, which we hope will improve now that the government does not have an overwhelming majority and no longer feels it can do anything it likes. Yeah. It is accountable as well to allies who may not share some of its views. It's startling to see how some of these things many of us were taking for granted have got eroded in the last 10 years. And that's worrying for any democracy. There are scholars at Harvard who have written about something called democratic deconsolidation. And they argue that you simply can't take for granted that democratic freedoms once achieved can be there forever, because in practice, they say, they can be diluted. You've seen it in America in some ways with Mr. Trump's refusal to accept his election result 4 years ago. You've seen it in many parts of Europe in recent elections. And certainly you've seen it in India. So that is worrying. The hollowing out of the autonomy of many of our institutions, the challenges to freedom of speech, the ability of the government to either cajole or cudgel the media into conformity has been truly worrying. And the one independent space that has existed has been digital media, because whereas a big mainstream newspaper or magazine is usually owned by some fat cat with other business interests, and you can always make sure that a tax rate or two on their other businesses will elicit conformity in their newspapers. That's not true of these small digital operations, which can be financed by a foundation and do their work freely and without fear or favor. So a lot of us turn more and more to digital media for honest reporting and insights, by comparison with what you see in the so-called mainstream press and mainstream television channels. But as I say, we're hoping that we will find that tendency will be arrested by the fact that this last election result has given us a government much more dependent on other parties. Of course, where the other parties share this government's agenda, then it will get through. But where there may be some doubts, for example, we've seen, on the Waqf Board bill, or on the provisions for lateral entry without reservations into government and so on, the different elements of their governing coalition have resisted them as the opposition has, and the government has had to be forced into a rethink. So I think there's some hope yet. But on the secularism thing, the saddest issue for many of us is that there has been a sort of toxin injected into the veins of our society that won't easily be drained out for a while. It takes a while to create social harmony. Remember, after the bitterness and savagery of partition, there was a very conscious effort made by the then government of India to encourage greater social harmony, to de-emphasize communal consciousness, to talk about the importance of syncretic civilization, the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb and all of that. And that has now been reversed so completely and so rapidly across northern India and the Hindi-speaking states that it's shocking to many of us who live a different reality. For example, in the south, where this is simply not there, this kind of poison, it's shattering for us to see our own compatriots telling us how difficult it is for them to be themselves, where Muslim friends talk about their teenage children being told by classmates, go to Pakistan, where tiny tots playing in the playground suddenly have a friend saying to them, my parents say I can't play with you because you're a Muslim. I mean, this kind of stuff was unthinkable in the India in which I grew up. And now it's sadly becoming more and more commonplace. And I do worry about that, because just changing an election result may not easily change the mentality of people that have been poisoned in this way.
And my second question was... sorry.
I think just in the interests of everybody else, we
Okay,
should.
all right.
I'm sorry. Please.
Right, Mr. Tharoor, thank you for joining us today. So
Sure.
I enjoyed your answer to the first question, not a political question, but I'm from Pakistan, married to an Indian, so our small contribution.
Good
to
for you.
world peace.
All right.
So it's actually by the way, my grandfather was foreign secretary for Nehru, Mia Azim Hussain. So the history is even more complicated.
Sorry, your father and
My
grandfather?
grandfather was Mia Azim Hussain, who was foreign secretary with Nehru.
Oh, my word, I see. So how did you end up on the wrong side of the border?
I need to write a book on that piece of it. But
You should. I actually have
so
written in the Times Literary Supplement about sitting at the World Cup match in 2019 between India and Pakistan in a mixed group of Indians and Pakistanis. And directly behind me was a couple just like you, where I think the husband was Indian and the wife was Pakistani, and they were holding each other's flags and waving them. And it was a magnificent feeling. And
Usually
certainly, you can see a lot of this happening. But unfortunately, you aren't the folks who want to bomb and kill and maim in the pursuit of your...
Life at home is okay except cricket, and then she's Gujarati, so the dal situation is a whole different thing. But the question is actually a literary one. So I don't have the writing skills to even write an elegant shopping list. But since...
As long as you buy the right item.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But since Gen AI, ChatGPT, I've become a stunning writer. So what's your view on that and its impact on writing, even maybe your own writing and the ability for people to create content, even write books? How do you think about that?
Look, I still tend to think that these are useful tools because they can research facts off the internet at a far greater speed and with far more comprehensiveness than anyone can do. I am, as a creative writer, I don't feel remotely threatened. I've never seen a paragraph from ChatGPT that can match the distinctive voice of a creative writer. I may be wrong. And maybe one day they'll get there. I know there's a lawsuit going on in Europe right now from artists whose paintings have been so successfully replicated by generative AI software that they now want their paintings taken off the web, and they want laws that will prevent artificial intelligence from replicating paintings in their styles. So if it can be done for visual art, maybe one day it can be done for writing, but I'm personally profoundly skeptical. I'm not even sure human beings can credibly imitate others, let alone a software program. For example, I'm a huge fan of P.G. Wodehouse, as is widely known, and I have read the 3 or 4 novelists who, with a license from the estate, have written Wodehouse-style novels after, and not one of them comes close, in my view, not even close. So there's something distinctive about human creativity that is linked to the individual person that I believe can't entirely be changed. And as you can imagine, lots of people in India have tried to get ChatGPT to write things in Shashi Tharoor's style, quote unquote. It's laughable. The ones they've sent to me, I know I don't really write like that or sound like that, and so I take it with a smile and move on. I don't think it's that easy for anyone else, let alone a software program, to be you.
Great, thank you.
So you're safe with your shopping list.
So you're sitting in the heart of
Dr.
Silicon Valley.
Shashi
I feel
Tharoor.
like you've thrown down the gauntlet amongst all these techies. You're going to try it. We have time for one more question.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor, this is Jay Galgali.
Hi, how are you?
I hope you
I
recognize
haven't
me.
met you, but you've done some great work in
Thank you.
resurrecting cricket videos
Yes.
and films. From
Thank you. I wanted to thank you in person for retrieving my channel from the clutches of Government of India's copyright, number one. Number two, this is not a question. It is 1983, India versus West Indies, and Kapil Dev is catching Richards, and I wanted, if Shashi Tharoor was sitting in the commentary box, how he would have described that epic moment. Can you do the imitation, please?
Let's do this some other time, Jay. I'm not going to embarrass myself in front of everybody. Actually, I actually heard that moment On a radio, on BBC. I was in Singapore in those days. There was absolutely no television live that I could watch at the time. I had to wait for my dad to record video cassettes in India and send them to me later. So I actually heard this live on BBC Radio. I'm sure they did a very good job because the moment was amazingly evocative. I mean, that ball soaring in the air, seemingly heading irresistibly to the boundary, and here is Kapil Dev running, and then almost looking over his shoulder and catching the ball. It was quite a historic moment, but you probably have to be there to just be caught up in the spirit of it. But thanks for that question. It's fun to see a cricket buff in the middle of...
Thanks for your support,
Yeah.
Shashi.
Well, as you know, at one point there was actually a very decent cricket culture in California at the turn of the previous century. There was a former England cricket captain called Cecil Aubrey Smith who came and became a minor Hollywood star from about 1902 to about 1920 odd. And he started the Hollywood Cricket Club, which then had a number of matches and toured various places and so on. So there was a kind of cricketing subculture here, so you haven't completely come to barren land.
I
great.
emailed you inviting you for a cup of chai, so do continue.
I made it such a short visit, I won't, but thank you for all you do for cricket.
Thank you.
And keeping memories alive. We should get one female voice in, I think, one female voice in at some point.
Please, yes.
I know they're strapped for time. I don't mind overstaying my welcome, but I think let's get a lady.
Hi, this is Maya Vishwakarma, and welcome to Stanford.
Hi.
I also fought election in 2014, Member of Parliament election from Hoshangabad, Madhya Pradesh constituency. I have a...
Who for, if I may ask?
Yeah. I mean, Modi ji came first time that he became Prime Minister.
Which party were you fighting on
Aam Aadmi
behalf
Party. Aam Aadmi Party, because in earlier days, the California was the hub for the Aam Aadmi Party. So I work as a volunteer, but since then I'm working at a grassroots level. I'm a Sarpanch, unopposed Sarpanch in my panchayat.
Wow, congratulations. What are you doing here?
The same place I born and brought up there. And your friend, Mr. Vivek Tankha, he's a very good supporter of me. Actually, he always encourages and he's a mentor.
Great.
Yes. So actually, I live here in Fremont, like in Stanford. I also worked in Stanford and UCSF in my
While being a sarpanch in a village in Madhya Pradesh, how do you do that?
Yeah. So I'm telling you because the last 10 years I've been working on a grassroots level. But after fighting this member of parliament election, I thought my need is near my village area, and especially for the women and the girls, because I came from that small village to Stanford area and also in UCSF. So having those years and experiencing all that difficulties, especially for the women education, I started a menstrual hygiene sanitary pads like Sukarma Foundation we started. But apart from that, my question is like, because I'm a sarpanch of the village and I have a hard time to establish the educational institution in India. And especially if I see like in Madhya Pradesh, you know, the BJP is very prominent. And we can see also like they are giving the very less funding for the education institution, especially the government. And if we see like if the women comes in the politics, they have a hardest time to execute all the policies, like the policy that you guys make in parliament and we implement as a sarpanch in the village. But if I say like the education part, if you want to uplift in a most rural area.
Excuse me, ma'am. The question is, how can parliamentary policy be carried out better by women?
Well, these are the basic fundamental educational policies that we used to see in the grassroots level when we are, implementing in school, like a girls' education, their rights.
Yes.
And restoring those buildings where the students are coming and sitting and studying. And most of the buildings are demolished.
Thank you.
I mean, they are just like, vanishing because of the infrastructure.
Thank you.
So my question is,
Thanks.
the politicians sitting in the parliament, if they are not allocating the money for the schools, then the other girls will come here, right?
Let's give Dr. Tharoor a chance to respond.
Yes. I want to know your views.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good question, because there's no question that we have been complaining. I've been speaking on behalf of my party on the budget for the last few years, and I've been complaining about the significant decline in resources allocated by the government to education. As a percentage of GDP, it's terribly low, and certainly you're quite right that we need more resources, particularly for government schools and particularly in the rural areas. So you're totally right. Thank you.
I've been asked to do a quick poll, and this might be a little bit embarrassing for our author sitting right here. How many of you want to get your book signed? Okay, that's a lot of hands, so that means we're going to actually have to reduce questions after 2 or 3 more, so thank you. This gentleman's been waiting patiently, and then I'll come to the lady in the green.
Thank you.
Please.
Hey, Shashi. My name is Vivek Chandran. I'm the author of the book, The 9 p.m. Debate, which talks about the sexual assault epidemic in India. It looks at both the problem as well as the solution.
What's the name of the book?
It's called The 9 p.m. Debate.
The 9 p.m.
Debate. It's also a takedown of the Indian television industry. I'll give you a book. I'll give you a copy of the book.
Sure.
My question is, you've written a book about India, Midnight to the Millennium. How do you see India in the next 25 years? And on a lighter note, my wife wanted to come and attend this program, but after listening to you for an hour, I'm glad she did not, because I would have to go home alone.
Thank you for the comment, and good luck with your book.
Great. People are queuing up outside right now for signing. You will turn to your right. Others, if you want to leave the building, to your left. We're not selling any books. Ma'am, you've got the honor of the last question. Thank you.
Thank you. Very honored. Dr. Tharoor, like you, I'm a history graduate from your rival college, Lady Shri Ram. And I think LSR has done pretty well for itself, like Stephens. My question for you is, as a historian, and this is something that worries me, and I'm sure it worries you, where do you see the discipline of history heading?
Where do I see
the discipline of history heading in India?
In India.
Well, look, history is always contested territory, and there's bound to be different views of the past, because what we think about the past, what we say and write about the past, is very much a reflection of what we care about in the present. And of course, with the BJP, we've seen some very specific attempts to rewrite history, particularly in school textbooks, not just rewriting, but also erasing certain things that they don't want to see highlighted. There are states, BJP-ruled states, where the Mughal emperors disappear, and relatively obscure Hindu nationalist heroes are hailed instead, and so on and so forth. So all I can say is that I think some of this, as long as all points of view have a chance to be expressed, debated, and sorted out, some of this is bound to happen, and we can live with it. History as a discipline is hugely important. And I think we have room for all kinds of history, serious historical scholarship, scholars doing their kind of thing, but also more and more popular histories are being written, which are being read and devoured by a larger public, and that's also extremely important, because their views of the past often reflect their attitudes towards the present. We're seeing this with Indian English language writing on history has become incredibly diverse and interesting. I'm not referring now to textbooks or academic writing, I'm just referring to popular writing. So they range from people reinterpreting some of our histories of the last 100 years in ways that favor their particular political point of view, rethinking characters, and you also have people trodding rather unfamiliar ground, subjects that haven't been explored in the past. And there's an amazingly rich vein of historical writing, popular historical writing, that's now finding publishers and finding a large audience. I would urge you to come and look at them all. There's, to my mind, enough to keep anyone occupied for years, just to read all that's available, whether it's new biographies of old historical figures, or just digging up of relatively unknown or forgotten people from history, courtiers of Akbar no one knew about, or sort of languishing heroes, Chidambaram Pillai, the man who tried to challenge the British shipbuilding monopoly. There's a book about him, fascinating. Very few people had known about him. He certainly doesn't figure in the standard school or university textbooks, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of ferment, a lot of bubbling energy. And I wouldn't be worried too much about BJP censoring a textbook or two, because there's so much more available if you only want to look for it.
All right.
Thank you.
On behalf of Dr. Ganguly and myself, thank you so much. Please give a round of applause. There are no books on sale. again, if you're interested in getting a signed, a book you've got signed, go out, turn right. Otherwise, the exit is straight out and to your left. Thank you all for your interest. Good night.